Hey guys, I'm Chris Buck and a very warm welcome to Friday Fretworks. And this week, a subject that I've always been a little bit scared to tackle if I'm entirely honest. Expensive guitar cables. Do they really sound better?
Tell me how it feels, baby. Because I don't know, no, yeah. And I don't know, no.
So a few months back, myself and my band Cardinal Black were incredibly fortunate to be given the opportunity of supporting Peter Frampton on his farewell run of UK shows. Obviously a pretty big deal for us. Not only have we been given an opportunity to support Peter, a living legend, on an incredibly important run of dates for him, but a chance to play some incredibly big, incredibly prestigious venues, such as the Royal Albert Hall, like you've just seen in the introduction clip of today's video. Big venues and, in the most literal sense, big stages, where it's really not uncommon for your amps to be maybe 15, 20, 25 foot behind you. And as such, it was a somewhat essential purchase to go out and buy some new instrument cables for that tour. My existing cables at this point were a good few tours old, so I guess I had some kind of niggling doubts in the back of my mind as to their durability. But also, my existing cables just weren't long enough. I think my longest cable was about 15 foot, and as I've just said, we were playing some pretty big stages. And as such, I went out and bought two Fender 25-foot professional series cables. But it was only once I bought them that it really set me thinking that I'd not really given it any forethought, if I was entirely honest. I just went for a name brand and the longest cable that I could find, but having never really invested in any more expensive cables than that, I have absolutely no idea whether they are worth the investment and ultimately whether they do sound any better. I guess I've never really bought cheap cables, save for when I was a kid buying those horrible fluorescent things that were about a £5 and would last about a fortnight. I've never bought cheap cables. My pedal board is wired with a mixture of Evidence SIS and Pedal Patch, both of which are brilliant, have never let me down, but when it comes to instrument cables, I guess I've always considered them somewhat breakable. It's really not uncommon for them to get lost or stolen or mislaid or mixed up on a festival bill. But given the tour that we're currently on, we are the only band and it's pretty much the same support act every night, I thought now would be a good opportunity to kind of finally invest in something a little bit more upmarket. Now, one of the reasons that I've always avoided this topic like the plague, at least when it comes to Friday Fretworks, is that to say it's a minefield or a bit of a rabbit hole would be something of an understatement. I guess I've always got that story or that somewhat mythological adage at this point of Stevie Ray kind of whirling around in the back of my mind of him famously preferring cheaper, coily Radio Shack cables because of their higher capacitance and because of their inherent high-end roll-off, preferring that with his amp setup, much to his tech Cesar Diaz frustration, apparently. Couple that with the fact that when it comes to choosing a high-end cable, you really are spoiled for choice these days. There are literally hundreds of brands, all no doubt professing to be the best, so it is a little bit of a minefield. And if I'm entirely honest, when it came to whittling it down to one cable brand, I literally just googled best guitar cable to see if there was anything approaching a consensus online, and the one name which consistently topped forum polls and magazine articles alike was Megami. High-end cables manufactured in Japan and in this case hand-wired in the UK. I guess as a Yamaha endorsee and a long-time fan of lawsuit-era Japanese-made guitars like Greco, Orville, Bernie and the like, it felt like it made sense, and as such I took a punt on two cables. Two 6-metre Ultimate Megami cables with silent Neutric or Neutrik jacks. Now, I've not really had a chance to try them out, at least in a comparison sense, to be honest, prior to this video. I've been using them on the first run of our tour dates out in Ireland last week, but in all honesty, I've been using such a radically different amp setup for those shows that certainly wouldn't have been the circumstances to be comparing them. I've not really had a chance to do a direct A-B comparison with my old cables to 5.5-metre Fender Professional Series cables that I was using prior to the Peter Frampton tour. Now, however, I'm home for a few days before the next leg of the tour kicks off, so here's a good chance to actually do a direct A-B comparison and I guess ultimately see whether they do actually sound any different. Now, it's worth mentioning there is, of course, a discrepancy in the length of the cables, the Mogami cables being 6 metres, with the Fender cables being 5.5 metres. So you've got a discrepancy there of 50 centimetres, but it's about as close as I could physically get it. The bigger discrepancy worth pointing out, however, is, of course, their price, with the Fender cable coming in at £17, with the Mogami cable coming in at £70. Now, for these next comparison clips, I'm going to be using my Panucci Gold Top. For the clean clips, plugged directly in using a single cable into my Fender Pro Reverb. But for the dirty clips, I'm going to be running through my Analog Man King of Tone, one cable in and one cable out. Of course, with the Fender cables, you've got a combined meterage, is that a word? Combined length of 11 metres. And with the Mogami cables, you've got a combined length of 12 metres. Let's see how we get on. Do they sound any different? So there you have it. Now, I guess the first thing worth pointing out is that when it comes to high-end, high-priced gear, it can generally make people a little bit defensive. Of course, that high price proving a little bit polarizing more often than not. But what I would say in my personal experience is that using higher quality, of course higher price components, inevitably so, will yield a result, whether that's in terms of audio quality or just general durability. This really isn't specific to guitar cables. I guess that's just in any form of life. But the ultimate question then being A, whether that difference is worth the extra money, and B, whether it actually yields a change for the better. Of course, in Stevie Ray's case, famously preferred the higher capacitance cables with their inherent high-end roll-off, and didn't like the increased output and the increased treble response that you get from lower capacitance cables, which, funnily enough, is exactly what I'm hearing in these Mogami cables. How much of this will translate through YouTube is honestly anyone's guess with its compression, but what I would say is that under my fingers, and crucially in the room, what I'm hearing coming back at me from the amplifier definitely is an audible difference with the Mogami cables. Again, whether that difference is then worth £53 per cable, honestly will vary from person to person, and each listener will have a vastly different experience and opinion on the situation. What I would point out, however, is that even in a relatively straightforward rig such as my own, where there's not too much going on apart from amps and pedal boards, the amount of cabling you are using very quickly starts to add up. If you think about it, you've got a 20-foot cable going from my guitar to my pedal board, a 3-foot cable connecting my first pedal board to my second pedal board with the modulation, probably, honestly, conservatively, 50, 60, maybe even 70 foot of cabling within that pedal board then, before another 20-foot cable going back to my amps, and then finally, two 2-foot-long cables connecting each amps together. So, again, conservatively, you're probably looking in the region of about 110 to 120 feet of cabling, at which point, higher quality, lower capacitance cable, at least if you're looking to retain as much of your original guitar signal and output voltage as possible, is going to be integral to maintaining a kind of purity and quality of tone, if that's something you're looking for, which, honestly, it may not be. All of that said, honestly can't say I was disappointed with the quality or the sound of the Fender cable. I've toured with them on numerous occasions, played the bloody Royal Albert Hall with one at the start of today's video, and recorded Cardinal Black's album on them as well, so I'm not here sat wishing I'd go back and re-record the album now using Mogami cables, certainly not. But that said, I will be using these Mogami cables going forward. I think take sound quality out of it for a second, which I guess, again, as I said, will vary from listener to listener and their general experience of what they're hearing. Take that out of it for a second. There is just a feel of quality and a sturdiness, I guess, if that's a word, for want of a better phrase, which just inspires a confidence that when you wrap these cables up, they will come back out of your case the next day in exactly the same condition that they went in. We've all had mysteriously kind of cables break overnight through apparently no fault of your own, but there is just confidence that you get with these cables, which I haven't necessarily got with any cables before. But in regard to their sound quality, I think you will notice a bigger difference if you are using longer cabling runs, where lower capacitance will inevitably give you a higher voltage output, or output voltage, and kind of more increased treble response as well. I think that's where you will really notice a difference. And I shall say no more on the matter, it's all got a bit confusing. As ever, I'm going to play you out now with a clip from our current tour, where of course I'm using these Mogami cables. But as ever, thank you very much for watching. I'm Chris Buck, this is Friday Fretworks. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I shall see you next week for another episode of Friday Fretworks. Cheers guys, take care, see you soon.